Hi, this is Paul, and I wanted to do another short video on Jordan Peterson's lying pastor comment. And I YouTube put a you know gave me an angry face, and angry as anything but how I received that comment. I in fact fully agree with the comment, and I know some of my pastor friends would not be happy me saying this, but I think he's dead on right, and I'll tell you why he's dead on right. I mean, one of the things that you learn as a pastor is that this profession almost forces you to be a hypocrite, because you have to you place it's what Jesus complains about in Matthew 23. In some ways, you place burdens on people that you can't carry yourself. Pastors are egotistical, full of narcissism, and as I just made another video on the church. Um, if you stay in this job long enough, it will teach you humility, because you will say things that you break, and you will violate your own conscience, and you will put burdens on people, and people who are supposed to have no faith or maturity at all will do things that will dramatically surprise you, and then you will be exposed for being the crappy Christian you are. And as I said in the other video, and you're supposed to be the representation of the archetype here in that local setting. And so, this is what happens to pastors. And of course, people are going to pick up on our lying. And the Gospels often remarks about how the people listened to Jesus because he was one who taught with authority. And I love how Peterson often talks about, it's not power alone that establishes hierarchy, and because power actually makes crappy hierarchies. It's competence and authority, and it's behind those things that people willingly and gladly submit, because they instinctively they know this is for their welfare. Well, but the one of the things that I wanted to comment too is Peterson will often say such laudable things about the Sermon on the Mount, and here as a preacher I know, boy, the Sermon on the Mount, that's about as high voltage in the Gospels as you get. And one of my favorite illustrations comes from the Reformed Journal, from a number of years ago. This is one of the somebody captured this in his blog, but it was Tim Keller did an illustration of it in a in a piece. But it's been around a while because it's from the Reformed Journal. Now, the Reformed Journal was a magazine put out mostly by professors at Calvin College. Again, my alma mater. This is my tradition. And a woman, an English professor named Virginia Stem Owens, wrote a piece, said, "God and the Man at Texas A&M," and this is from 1987. "Most of the students at my university come from middle-class, conservative Republican families. Their vices were like the values are traditional: weekend drunkenness and sexual promiscuity, things a parent can understand. Therefore, when I assigned my freshman English class the Sermon on the Mount, a selection in their rhetoric textbook taken from the King James Version, I had expected them to have at least a nodding acquaintance with the reading and to express a modicum of piety in their written responses. After all, Texas has been considered at least marginally part of the Bible Belt." And now pay attention, she's writing in 1987. So all of the ideas of the nuns and post-Christians and all of that, boy, that's still yet to come. This is 1987. In the heart of the Bible Belt. "The first paper I picked up began, 'In my opinion, religion is one big hoax.' I was mildly surprised, since this came from a student who had never expressed a single iconoclastic notion the entire semester. I glanced at the opening sentence of the rest of the paper. There is an old saying that you shouldn't believe everything you read, and it applies in this case. All right, I thought, maybe this was just a fluke. I reached for the third paper. 'It is hard to believe something that was written down thousands of years ago,' it began. 'In the Bible, Adam and Eve were the first two people, and if they were, then where did black people come from?' Also, the Bible says nothing about dinosaurs, and I think God would have mentioned them.'" I love, student papers. I put down my red pen. This was no fluke. What I had there was a major trend. It was not, of course, the loose-jointed logic nor the minimalist approach to spelling and punctuation that surprised me, although as a teacher I might feel duty-bound to probe their syllogisms and circle their misspellings. The question that I was personally interested in was, why were these students, A, so angry at what they read, and B, so blithe in their dismissal of it? They're reading the Sermon on the Mount! My own introduction to the Sermon on the Mount was a child in Sunday school, had been accompanied by pastel poster illustrations of Jesus sitting like a patient Mr. Rogers on a green hillside surrounded by eager pink children. It had never occurred to me either to be angry or to turn away from such a scene. As I read on, the answer to the first part of my question became clear. To wit, the stuff the churches preach is extremely strict and allows for almost no fun without thinking it is a sin or not. Now refer to the previous video that I'm following about in the Cold War period, the church's moral and ethical stances were generally aligned with the rest of the culture. The church just seemed to be an extreme case, but there was general alignment in the Cold War. So this person says, wow, the church is too strict. I do not like the Sermon on the Mount. It was hard to read and made me feel like I had to be perfect, and no one is. The things taken in this sermon are absurd. To look at a woman as adultery? That is the most extreme, stupid, and unhuman statement that I've ever heard. And I love this because I don't know if they have any idea that it's Jesus, because Jesus often has this reputation in popular society of, well, Jesus is tolerant and Jesus is nice. And when I hear people say that, I think, you've never read the New Testament, have you? Well, these people obviously hadn't. At this point, I began to be encouraged. There is something exquisitely innocent about not realizing you shouldn't call Jesus stupid. This is not exactly intellectual agnosticism talking here, usually the perceived foe of faith. It is just down-home hedonism. It was Herod watching Salome dance. It was the disciples asking, who then can be saved, when Jesus deflated their dreams of wealth with the needle's eye. This was, page 4, this was the real thing. A pristine response to the gospel, unfiltered through a 2 millennia cultural haze. In fact, the anger is preferable to the blithe dismissal of the text I found in other papers. Many believe that this sermon should be taken literally. I believe, on the other hand, that because the sermon has been interpreted from so many different languages, we should use them as a guide, not law. Another fallback is that certain beatitudes are irrelevant to current lifestyles. Loving your enemies, for instance, is obviously not observed by the majority today. Of course it's not observed! Unfortunately, I have yet to come across a student who sees any logical contradiction between this morality by consensus stance and their favorite proverb, who's to say? It's different things to different people. In another paper, however, one which also relied on the irrelevancy premise, I found the most disconcerting assessment of all. In this essay, the author explains the doctrines of an era in the past which cannot be brought into the future in the same context. This essay now cannot be taken the same way it was written. It can be used as a guideline for good manners. Again, there's nothing new under the sun. This stuff that we deal with today and we think, oh, this is all new. There's nothing new under the sun. The Sermon on the Mount is a guideline for good manners. This is after they actually read it. Read the Sermon on the Mount. I'm going to get into the Sermon on the Mount at some point because Peterson keeps bringing it up. Good manners? Was this all that remains of the old-fashioned piety I had expected? The Sermon on the Mount reduced to suggestions by Emily Post? Not all my students were religious illiterates, let me add, but that did not necessarily divert the undercurrent of anger. Some had gone to Sunday school. A few had attended parochial school. One said he learned a lot going to these schools. The discipline and religion have both helped me. He does not specify how. But one young woman who admitted she had drifted away from the church lately said, "No one knows exactly what to believe. If pondered enough, one can find reasons to prove almost all aspects of religion false. and she, more than any of her classmates, was offended by the Sermon on the Mount appearing unexpectedly in her textbook. This is a direct quote from the Bible. Why is this in a literature book? It simply states that I've studied in Sunday school and confirmation over the past 18 years. I see no point in this. College is a time to reassess your life. Well, at least one thing, she could have agreed with Jordan Peterson that college is a time to reassess her life, but this is a woman in complaining about the proto-safe space has been violated by the Sermon on the Mount. So what do I make of these responses? First of all, now I understand why in literature classes no one has to explain the simplest biblical allusion. And one has to explain the simplest biblical allusion. Even references to Jonah and the whale and Noah and the ark. Beyond that, however, I find it strangely heartening that except for the young man who found the Sermon on the Mount a guide to good manners, the Bible remains offensive to honest, ignorant ears, just as it was in the first century. For me, that somehow validates its significance. Whereas the scripture almost lost their characteristically astringent flavor during the past century, the current widespread biblical illiteracy should catapult us into a situation more nearly approximating that of their original first century audience. The Bible will no longer be choked by cloying cultural associations. Clearly, this prospect presents a number of frightening possibilities also. The underpinnings of society as we know it, already sagging dangerously, may collapse completely. Virginia Stem Owens is in agreement with Jordan Peterson. As Western civilization expends what little biblical capital it has left, we may find ourselves living impoverished, not in just the postmodern age, but in the new barbarism, a sort of fluorescent dark age, like the inside of a mall. On the other hand, those who dream of something brighter than fluorine and neon pastel posters to illuminate their lives may, by these living words, be lured outdoors into true light. Virginia Stem Owens. So wonderful reading, one of my favorite passages from that terrific publication, the Reformed Journal. And I just want to close with a piece that I keep on my blog. I'll often use my blog to throw up quotes that I want to be able to find, and then I look at how many of these quotes get traction. And this quote is continually brought up, I'm sure, by Google for people looking for it because it's one of my favorites. It's from Annie Dillard. In her book, Teaching a Stone to Talk. Why do people in church seem like cheerful, brainless tourists on a package tour of the absolute? Does anyone have the foggiest idea what sort of power we blithely invoke? Notice blithe by both Virginia Stem Owens and Annie Dillard. Or, as I suspect, does no one believe a word of it? That's probably true. And this is why pastors are liars. The churches are children playing on the floor with their chemistry sets, mixing up a batch of TNT to kill a Sunday morning. It is madness to wear ladies' straw hats and velvet hats to church. We should all be wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and light and signal flares. They should lash us to our pews. For the sleeping God may wake someday and take offense, or the waking God may draw us to where we can never return. Which is, again, exactly C.S. Lewis's point in his great quote on pantheism, which I'm sure I'll read for another day. So I just can't let Peterson's lying pastor thing go because it was just simply too delicious, and I hope you enjoyed these quotes.